What were they doing in Auschwitz?
Well, that's another something else that few people know. We've been told that there was the Auschwitz concentration camp, but it was run by crazy SS people, and it was basically a racially motivated concentration and extermination camp, which in fact it was in part. But the reason why it became that factory of death was the decision of IG Farben in 1941 to build what was to become the largest corporate structure outside Germany, wartime Germany. 24 square kilometer size industrial plant to produce synthetic rubber and other war essential synthetic products which they needed for the conquest of Russia and Eastern Europe and Asia ultimately. And IG Auschwitz, this huge plant in the city of Auschwitz, required a lot of slave labor, and so the nearby concentration camp of Auschwitz was turned into a giant slave labor camp. And slave labor, of course, meant at the time that if you were working at the IG Farben construction site of building this monster of synthetic production plant, you were only needed by Bayer, BASF, and Höchst as long as you could work. Once you were sick or they had worn you out, there was no health insurance or retirement plan. They were killed, and thousands of them were just killed. It was called extermination through labor. And if you remember that sentence, labor liberates, it was the Nazi speak, or Nazi newspeak, I should say. And if you remember the inscript on the concentration camp of Auschwitz, labor liberates, Arbeit macht frei, it was Nazi newspeak for exactly the opposite. It was killing, extermination through slave labor. And also the experiments, the medical experiments then were not conducted on behalf of the SS. The SS was a troop of murderers. They didn't have the intelligence to create drugs or anything commercially accessible and of any value. They were the guys who executed the commercial interests of Bayer and Höchst, mainly those two companies, who tested their drugs, patented drugs, new drugs, in Auschwitz and Buchenwald and some other smaller concentration camps in order to make them ready for the world market. And now when all that has been part of the Nuremberg War Crime Tribunals, at the time when we started this work, there was nothing, absolutely nothing about the tribunal from Nuremberg on the web, the tribunal from Nuremberg against IG Farben, against Bayer and BASF and Höchst, on the web. In fact, there were no books, it wasn't in printed form available either. And I got curious, I said, well, how much money do you need to spend from these companies to cover your past? Not just in the newspapers, but also in books, in the history books, in everything our children are being taught in school about the origin of World War II. And so our foundation went ahead and we found quite some documents in national archives about this trial, and we published by now about 50,000 of these records on Profit Over Life online, and there's no way that the current understanding of World War II by the general public, that it was a racially motivated war, can be upheld. There's no way. It was the second attempt of the chemical pharmaceutical cartel from Germany at world conquest, based on 40,000 patents or what they had at the time, trying to impose that economic money printing machine on the world.
Do you think it might be a third attempt to do it?
Yeah, obviously what we see today is, going back to 1945, again what we saw is that the political and the military puppets were sentenced in Nuremberg to death or to lifetime in prison, and rightly so. But the puppeteers, the guys who actually planned this war and made it possible and hired the Nazis to implement it, they were sentenced with a few years, like for example the CEO, the chief executive of Bayer, Termier, was sentenced to 7 years in prison in 1948. In 1956, 8 years later, he was not only out of prison, he was back as the chairman of the board of Bayer again. Now, what do we learn from that? We learn from it that the interest groups had a certain continuity. And that was in 1956, exactly the year when the final documents on the Brussels EU were signed. When the German government, with Bayer being its corporate flagship, became the driving force of this Brussels EU. And you can see that by the mid-50s, meaning 10 years after their second attempt failed, they were back in business, and they were right at it to create the third attempt, this time without military component, but by means of a heinous strategy of economic strangulation and of political coercion. At that time, 60, 70 years ago now, they knew that the day would come that Spain is in this crisis that is today, that Italy will soon be there, that Greece is in that. They knew that at that time. And that was their target, that was their goal, the predetermined goal.
It's all planned.
Excuse me?
It's all planned.
It was all planned. And you will see that in a few days there will be some politicians meeting in Brussels or Strasbourg and saying, oh, we should take advantage of this crisis and unite and make a political union out of Europe, or the United States of Europe. And so, shall we say, 7 decades after their second attempt failed, they reached their ultimate goal, almost. Meaning that they create a body in Europe that rules every part of life, not democratically. You cannot elect them, you cannot throw them out of office. They are there to control you and your life.
With Europe, we cannot.
With the Brussels EU, yeah. So the Brussels EU, the construct of the Brussels EU is the third attempt. And they never came that close. I mean, some people say, oh, you know, the Nazis were ruthless destroyers they were just there to destroy everything. It's a crazy thought. They were ruthless, they were criminals, and there's nothing better to say about them. They deserved every punishment in the world, but they were hired because of their ruthlessness by these corporate interests. And the interests of these corporate interests, they were not interested in destruction. They were interested in making one thing, money, and controlling that, and controlling the markets, and turning Europe into a platform to conquer the world. And this is where they are now. If you see the Brussels EU envoys flying to Africa and saying, hey, African Union, you need to model your continental government according to the Brussels EU. And suddenly you have a commission of the African Union. And they go to South America, to the Mercosur, and they go to Southeast Asia, to the ASEAN states, and they sell their model as the future of, I don't know what, of an Orwellian world or what? Probably.
World order.
One world order, yeah. And they know they cannot accomplish that in one sweep, so their plan is to do it with those regional, continental takeovers, exporting the undemocratic Brussels model to other continents, and then ultimately uniting it under one umbrella, obviously, yes.